Today, I want to talk about something a little different than I typically talk about, and it was inspired by a young man in about his 30s or so who has a channel talking about his adventures in sub-Saharan Africa. And I hadn't listened to his channel in a while, I think because he hadn't really posted since I last looked, or maybe I missed it in the feed. But in any case, he was talking about his recent return to the United States, and I was a bit surprised until he got into the reasons why he was returning. As it turns out, he had completed a second of two relationships over a span of, I think, about 4 or 5 years. And he decided, since it hadn't really worked out despite his best efforts, he was returning to the United States. And the part of the feedback he gave, and it was pretty mature in my uh, opinion, he was forthright regarding where he uh, could have acted differently, not necessarily in the relationship itself, but how he went about the relationship and some of the things he learned. So I think it was very useful for folks who, uh, particularly maybe, for lack of a better term, passport bros, and the weight all that term entails. But anybody who basically looks outside of their Western country, in this case, he's from the United States, actually about an hour from where I am, coincidentally enough, and ventures particularly to sub-Saharan Africa to, for the prospects. That was in his initial intent, but essentially for the prospects, if you're a single guy in your 30s, that might be one of the things you think about. Maybe meeting someone, perhaps starting off knowing them, dating, and eventually something more of a longer term relationship up and perhaps including marriage and children. And so he just talked about some of the feedback, and I'll put a link to his video in the description, or maybe a card, so you can watch it yourself, because I think he articulates it well. He had asked for feedback, and I gave some, a comment in his video, and it was longer than I expected. And it occurred to me that I essentially have and did something similar. I'm Nigerian American, married to a Nigerian, and married almost 20 years now, and I could nod my head to some of the things he mentioned. The cultural differences, the less of a stigma to the age difference. Not something he specifically mentioned, but something I extrapolated from some of the things he said. And that's quite true. It's not unusual for, you know, a 10-year difference in a relationship, given a woman being, let's say, mid-20s or above. It's not unusual, right? It's not something that is taboo like it is in the West, particularly the United States. What I did want to comment on was a couple of things that I mentioned in that post, and I think bears expansion on. One is giving oneself enough time in the country of whomever you're hoping to form a longer relationship with. Not that his time was particularly short by today's standards, not at all. The only reason I bring it up is that when you have two people from the same culture, okay, it's hard enough with the challenges of relationships, but across cultures, across countries, across age groups, generations, it just adds a lot more to it. Now, you just need time to work out through all those things that you wouldn't necessarily have in a relationship from the same culture, but in addition to. So you just naturally need more time. Whether it's language, customs, religion, uh, ideas on what relationships are, short, long term, all those things take extra. And then add to that if you have like a generational or age difference, or exposure difference, or education difference, that just is a multiplier. So you need a lot of time to really get to know the person and have them know you and expectations and just all that stuff. And also where you're going to reside. He was smart, and this is what I recommend, is you have to be in that person's country. In this case, he's male and she's female. The long distance thing isn't going to work. It just isn't going to work. At least not long term. Okay, you're going to need some time on the ground where you really get to see this real person over time. Excuse me. And he did do that. I think the challenge for him is that these women were younger, in like their 20s, and they may not have had the exposure slash maturity and experience, that combination, that short amount of time he did, I think just a few to a couple of years for each would have been enough. I think if they were maybe around his age, to his point, very different, because in my experience, African women mature much more faster than women in the West, hands down, like hands down. They may be differences in perhaps a naivete when it comes to exposure, but not in terms of like maturity, adulting. Like I've never seen that as an issue. Uh, the typical Nigerian 20-something-year-old is well on her way, mature beyond her counterpart in the United States. Like hands down, I haven't seen any exception to that in my entire life. But what you will find, and I think this is what he may have been alluding to, is that the exposure, right, to things outside of the proverbial village or city or town in real time that the woman may not be exposed to. Yes, she might have, obviously, a smartphone, sees YouTube, the internet, but that's not the same thing as, for example, having traveled abroad or gone to school abroad and been exposed to a vastly different and Western culture. And so that does make a difference. So that may be what I infer from what some of the things he said. Another thing that he acknowledged wasn't necessarily a good idea, and I've seen older men my generation do it, particularly as they venture to Southeast Asia, pursuing a relationship, as that to basically, for lack of a better term, choose to finance in varying degrees more than you typically would in the West for a similar stage of relationship. For example, if you're dating a 20-something here in the US, okay, there's not an expectation that you would help with the rent, because typically that 25-year-old is going to be in a higher socioeconomic level than her counterpart in maybe a developing or emerging country. That's just the facts. However, there is the caveat as to when you would do that sort of thing. You wouldn't do that sort of thing when you're dating, or I would say under the 1 year mark, or even 2 year mark, with no sort of formal like engagement or something. In terms of, I would say, putting down real money, like putting down money for her rent or something like that. And it varies from culture to society, but you want to measure any sort of financial assistance towards alongside of how the relationship is progressing. Similar to what you would do in the West, but maybe at a different pace and rate. So There's certain things you do when you're dating a week. There's certain things you do when you're dating for 5 years. And your mileage may vary. So it's the same thing, in a place like Nigeria, only when and how might vary. But the general idea is similar, is congruent. So that was the other thing. And again, he acknowledged that he was very mature and I think level-headed in his assessment. And the only thing I would add to that is he had talked about being able to meet such African women in the United States. And that is absolutely true. Quite possible. Quite possible, especially in this era. Um, when I was his age, it wasn't as many. They were there, but just not at the level. But now, definitely. The caveat with that is the westernization is real, particularly if you're looking for a long-term relationship, maybe even marriage. It is unavoidable that they will assimilate not only the good, but the not so good qualities of life in the United States. I'm just going to keep it 100. So I always advise people, and you'll have other YouTubers who give more line of that kind of relationship advice would, typically advise the same. If you're going to marry, as much as possible, don't bring her back to the West and stay in her culture. But I'll go deeper on that for two reasons. One, culturally, she may be very quite attached to where she's from. And a lot of these cultures, African cultures, Asian cultures, especially Nigerian cultures, family is like you marry the woman, you marry the family, right? And so, depending on the woman's socioeconomic um, situation, um, it will serve the longevity of the engagement or marriage or even super long relationship if you are able and willing to reside where she is. Uh, Again, there are exceptions to this, but in general, it's a good idea. In my case, as I put in my comment, mine is a little different. We're both Nigerian. I went to primary school in Nigeria. My parents are Nigerian. Our families know each other. Certain parts of our families know each other. We're from the same city. We actually went to the same primary school. I would find out uh, once we got married. Uh, I think we were there overlap for about a year. So my point is that I knew what I was getting into, you know, marrying a Nigerian, bringing her back to the States. And it was still challenging being married and still being married all those years. So, um, we from the same tribe and, we can both speak Yoruba. So it's a lot easier than if I was, black American, never left the United States or lived uh, sub-Saharan Africa and didn't really have the cultural exposure. It's going to be a lot harder. Is it impossible? Absolutely not. I know many black Americans of my generation who married Nigerians, great marriages. Also, from the Caribbean who married Nigerians, like great, just great. So again, there are exceptions to everything, but it's just much more difficult. Aside from that, the last thing I would mention, and he was pretty fair about this, is what always comes up in these relationships, particularly if there's any mention of money or financial support, is that, they're coming here for the visa. And to avoid binary thinking, I won't say it never happens or it always happens. But it's just something to be aware of that, it could be a possibility that this individual might see you as the Western male as a means to an end, right? And that is why it's helpful to be in her country, whether it's Nigeria or wherever in sub-Saharan Africa, and really get to make sure, okay, you do your due diligence on ground. So you know how she is around her people, you know the culture, you know the environment. Uh, and if she's not pushing to move, that's a big win. That's something he mentioned that I want to double down on. If the woman isn't pushing to go anywhere, or even she says, you know what, I'd rather stay in Nigeria, right? I know that sounds shocking to some people, but there are women, professional women, business women who it'll take a lot for them to let all of their established um, wealth or professional career go like that. I mean, my wife was a full-fledged professional when we got married. So it wasn't just a matter of just her coming over here. There was a sacrifice which I had to basically account for when she got here because it would be a while before she was able to um, work. And so, there are a lot of women like that, particularly as you move into your late 20s, early 30s that are professionals. And it's not just a matter of, oh, the American is here, let's get that visa. A lot of times it's like, wow, I'm the breadwinner of my family. I'm supporting the family. My parents are here. Me just leaving is going to be an economic hardship. So unless there's a superb reason to leave and essentially start over in another country, I need to kind of think this through. So I'm glad that he made that point as well. So anyway, check out the video. A lot of good information. And as I told the brother, I wish him all the best. And for him not to give up, in terms of looking to the continent, I didn't get it right on the first try myself either. So I encourage you, if you're watching, to, if time allows again, travel back and who knows.